Hi, welcome to another episode of the podcast with Jen and Lindsay. Jen, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Lindsay. We've had a really great week. Our guest today, is Pepper Stetler, and I usually see her like once or twice a year, and I get to see her twice in 1 week. So
That's
Yay!
so
yeah,
exciting. Your book
uh,
is incredible.
it is.
Oh, thank
So
you so much.
Mhm.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
yeah, so Pepper Stetler has written on issues facing people with intellectual disabilities and their caregivers in venues such as the New York Times, the Atlantic, Slate, and the Washington Post. She's also an art historian and writes about early 20th century art and photography. She has contributed essays to exhibition catalogs for the Museum of Modern Art and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and she is the recipient of the Art Writers Grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation, among other awards. She lives in Oxford, Ohio, and is a professor at Miami University, my alma mater. Woo woo! With her husband and her daughter, Louisa. So thank you, Pepper, for being here and for advocating with me on Monday up at the State House. I think people saw us on TV on
On
Monday.
the news, that's
Yeah.
right.
So thank you for being here. We
Yes,
really are
thank you for
excited.
having me.
There's so many things we could talk about, but today we're going to talk about your new book, which I am trying to get out there as much as I can, just because I'm like a fangirl of yours. And you're like, thanks for marketing my book, Jen, because I brought it with me to the State House on Monday and like I was telling everybody about it. She's like, I'm glad you did,
I
because
know I'm terrible at self-promotion, so like it is excellent to have Jen around. I really appreciate it.
so tell us, the book is called A Measure of Intelligence, One Mother's Reckoning with the IQ Test. So tell us about the book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, so um right. So maybe I can start with like, you Jen, you mentioned in the intro that I'm like trained as an art historian. So this was a new kind of writing project for me that was incredibly important and satisfying and rewarding to me. And I came about it um really because like my as many listeners probably can identify with, like I had that first IEP meeting before Louisa started kindergarten when she was about 5 and kind of transitioning from preschool into kindergarten. And this was kind of the first time where for like I don't know why it was the first time because it had been happening before this, but it was the first time in which I really had to kind of face um, evaluation and assessment and cognitive tests. Like it was maybe more explicitly presented to me as like, we have given your daughter an IQ test and here are her results. And we talked about them, and it seemed like there was some way in which they were going to have some sort of impact on the IEP and the kind of accommodations that were written for it. But then at the same time, I had the school psychologist kind of saying things like, you know what, the IQ test doesn't really matter. Teachers aren't going to see it. They're not going to like look at it and then make determinations about how they treat Louisa in the classroom. So in a lot of ways, I was just really confused about what was going on here because, I also knew at that time kind of superficially about this history of IQ tests and the eugenics movement in the early 20th century, and that kind of bothered me. Um, and so it was like, okay, so this is happening. And like I wanted to understand what was going on. And then at the same time, like I had to admit to myself that part of this meeting was the school psychologist kind of telling me pretty matter of factly, like, your daughter's IQ is where we would expect it to be for somebody with Down syndrome. It's below what they say is normal, but it's actually kind of high for a kid with Down syndrome. And there was like a small part of me I had to admit that was kind of like fist bump. Yes, like it's I had somehow, I guess, done something right is how that felt to me, but also I was kind of aware that this was icky and I didn't feel quite comfortable with the weird pride I felt in her IQ. So like there was a lot going on, and because I'm a writer and a researcher, I kind of like just started trying to write to figure this out, like figure out my feelings about it, research about the history of this, starting reading like psychology journals and trying to understand the way psychologists think about IQ. And then like I just like had a Word doc filled with words, and it was kind of like, oh, I think I have something going on here that I want to like keep working on, and I want to say.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I started writing before I realized I was writing a book.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how it came about, is um I wanted the perspective of someone who is not an expert, like a psychologist, to matter in this conversation and be part of this conversation. There's a huge literature in psychology about IQ tests, but less so from the perspective of, say, someone that has to take the IQ test, or
Yeah.
mother of somebody who has to take IQ tests. And I wanted there to be that kind of voice as part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I feel like you did such a great job. What struck me is exactly what you just said, that your honesty about the fact that you are a mom who's a professor, your husband's a professor, you guys went to really good schools. When you were pregnant with Louisa, you were thinking, is it going to be Brown? Is it going to
Oh
be
my
Yale?
God.
What's it going
Yeah,
to, and I have the
Illinois.
same, I mean, I come from the same, my husband has his master's, I took the bar,
Yep.
I'm an attorney. So
Yep.
like, and I feel like 90% of our Down syndrome moms in our 2012 group are all professionals. Not
Yeah.
that, I mean, there's teachers, there's lawyers, there's doctors, there's
Yep.
a lot of veterinarians in our group,
Ah,
a lot of professionals. So I think all of us were having this way of thinking and kind of being that like, yeah, my kid, they have to meet their milestones, even if it's the Down syndrome milestones, like they have to
Hmm.
meet those like higher than
yes.
the other, even if you're not really thinking that, it's part of it. And it's like, it was
Yes.
refreshing to like see it in print, but also like you kind of get your whole journey with it. And it was refreshing. So I appreciate it. I wish I would have had this book, is what I keep saying. I wanted to have this book about 10 years ago when my kids are about 4 and 2. But I'm really grateful that it's here now, because I know that there's families just like ours that are in
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
spot who are like, what are these tests and do they matter? And I just feel like it's so much thrown at you that it's now you have a resource to kind of like help you kind of navigate some of this. And
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I did hope it could be useful in that way, because I didn't find many books after Louisa was born that I felt helped me in, and were coming from a kind of worldview that was going to seem true to me.
yeah.
Um, and like, so I'm glad that it might be helpful. I also think, like, I don't know, Jen, I think this book would have scared the hell out of me when Louisa was two. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I would have been able to uh process all of this, in the sense that like the book is very much like, I guess a lesson from it is like, there is nothing wrong with your kid. It is the way that the world perceives your kid
Right.
that
Hmm.
is really problematic. And like that to me is scary.
It
Like the
is.
fact that it is about the world that is set up in a way to understand intelligence, um that makes it so hard for our kids to have a fulfilling life. But honestly, like, another thing I learned from the book was that, uh it's a book that is inspired by my experience being Louisa's mother, but I very quickly realized that it is not a book about the experience of being Louise's mother. It's a book that's
Mhm.
about this way of thinking about intelligence that affects all of us, right?
Yeah.
Like it is a logic that shapes our world, and whether even if you don't have to have an IQ test every 3 years, like people with intellectual disabilities are supposed to do for services in school, you are impacted by this test. And I see it even
Mhm.
in my college students. Our way of thinking about success and thinking about intelligence is very informed in like what you just described, Jen, with the kind of expectations of the professional class of people, right? It is gold star getting, right?
Yes.
Like you have to have a good grade. It is obsessed with comparison, but doesn't want to admit that it's obsessed with comparison.
Right.
And I'm like I try in the book to be as ambivalent about this as possible and hold that tension where like I am part of this. Like I got gold stars. I was motivated by gold stars. I'm an achiever, for the sake
Mhm.
of achieving, um and I'm good at succeeding in this system of intelligence that we have. But like at the same time, my head and my understanding of IQ tests and intelligence now is totally in conflict
Yeah.
with that.
Agreed.
And this kind of the way that culture is so deeply unhealthy, even unhealthy for people that are considered quote unquote normal, right? Like most of my college students. I truly believe that the mental health issues that we're seeing in college and my college students are to some degree um, influenced by this kind of culture of achievement and comparison that is informed by intelligence and the IQ tests.
Yeah. I I do think it would have been a hard read for me as a young mom
Yeah.
because you
Mhm.
do delve into the really dark history of eugenics in our country. Tell us why it's important to bring up that history as it relates to the IQ test
Hmm.
and why it matters for not just our kids, but all people.
Yeah. It's really complex because the actions made from and the decisions made from IQ tests are more subtle, I think, and the discrimination is more subtle than it was in the 1920s and the 1930s, but that certainly doesn't mean it's not there. So just to make sure like listeners are familiar with the history here, IQ tests kind of developed with a man named Alfred Binet in France in the early 1900s, and then by 1920s or so, 19 teens, 1920s, it had been adapted by this man named Henry Goddard, who was a psychologist and worked at an institution, a training school, as it was called, and uh, used IQ tests basically as a way of making a scientific, as he thought of it, case for segregating people who he termed, feeble-minded, um, that were called feeble-minded at the time, segregating them out of the school system, right? And making not only that, but um, deeply racist cases about how white Americans are more naturally intelligent because they have higher IQ scores than um, uh, immigrants, for example, coming from countries like Italy and Russia and so forth. They weren't scoring well on an IQ test, and so they were less intelligent, and so we don't want them in the country, right? So there's these racist arguments that are attached to the purportedly objective data of IQ tests. And I talk in the book about how flawed this is. And then, it leads to the most horrific kind of outcomes of eugenics, which is the sterilization of people that have low IQ scores, right? And again, like those aren't things that happen as much anymore. But there are ways in which it seems as if, the kinds of battles that we are fighting for people, our kids with disabilities in the schools and otherwise are still informed by that kind of logic of segregation, right? That kids long after the eugenics movement are separated. If you have an intellectual disability, you're put in a separate classroom, right? Like, so eventually, like, there's a lot that all kids have to have a right to public schools, but they're put in a separate, isolated classroom, right? Like, this is a way in which, for the rest of the 20th century and still today, we're kind of working, trying to undo this logic of segregation and a kind of hierarchy of opportunity that Goddard and the eugenics movement really put in place, right? Like, so why do we have to have IDEA, for example, IDEA, because of this logic of segregation, right? Of a lack of opportunity for people with disabilities and a way in which resources go to those in power, right? Those that are either considered normal or people who are considered like highly intelligent and gifted, right? They're the ones that have the power and get the resources of education. So there's other things to talk about it in the way that Goddard really sets up this association of people with low intelligence with behavior problems, right? Like, they're seen as being behaviorally deviant. And that's another reason why they shouldn't be bothering the normal kids in the classroom, right? So we see this too. Like, there's this association of behavior of kids that are struggling in a classroom with like being a bad kid, right? Like, and that's still with us today, um, as well. So, like, Goddard was a psychologist, and this is a pretty unsavory part of the history of the discipline of psychology. And I don't mean my book to be like this takedown of the discipline of psychology, but one thing I do want it to do is to force psychologists to kind of reckon with that history. As an art historians have to reckon with the history of the fact that we have stolen objects from cultures in colonized countries and brought them back, and stolen them from the cultures that they belong to. And I think psychology, like any other discipline, has to reckon with this history. And I want to give an opportunity for psychologists to, I think about how they're using IQ tests, why they're using IQ tests, if there are ways in which they're using them differently than they did in the 20th century. And I think that is absolutely true, that psychologists are using IQ tests in different ways than they are in the 20th century, but we still need to kind of think about um, what role and what purpose do IQ tests serve in psychology and in diagnosis today?
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the running theme that kind of kept hitting me was it seems to me in my life and in this, what you're trying to say in this book is that IQ tests are a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like it's, if you
Right.
get a low score, it means basically you take that inward as a parent, you take that inward as the child. Our kids know, like what's going on.
Yep.
We don't give our kids enough credit. For knowing, what that test is saying about them and what those meetings are saying. Especially like if you're our kids who are going to a lot of those IEP meetings.
Yep.
That's the way it's all set up. It's just so it's hard not to have that just tell you kind of how your kid's trajectory is going to go, and to where you're like, yep, stamped it, this, we're going to go to this certain room in the school, we're going to have these certain classes, they're going to be resource type classes, probably not going to go to college, and you're kind of going down this path, and you're kind of like, well, all these expectations I had, where we can't really fulfill those because of that score that we got on that one test,
Mhm.
or multiple tests that we get every 3 years and
Mhm.
are in the 1 percentile. And I think
Yep.
it, like you said, it denies students like the environments that they actually need to like learn. So talk more about that, because I really want people to understand that we're not saying that there shouldn't be rooms in school. Like, so my Jack is in a social communication classroom.
Yep.
He thrives in there, like, so I never want people to think, well, gosh, we need these resources. The resources are what we need. Exactly. And the
Right.
care, the kind of care is what we need. What we don't need is like some label that kind of predicts nothing for our kids, because it really, these tests weren't developed very well, thinking about like what our kids actually can do in society.
No, I mean they were basically designed so that our kids would do bad on them,
Yeah.
right? Like it's this kind of tautology of, like you're saying, the tests were designed basically for our kids to do bad on them, but then they seem to purport to like diagnose something about our
Yes.
kids, right?
Yeah.
And it is a kind of circular logic in that way. And right, so it's like it's not as if I am arguing that like the tests are actually Louisa should be doing much better on an IQ test or something like that. Like I'm not, that's not what I'm saying at all, but I'm saying that there's a way in which the world has been set up to reward people that do do well on the kinds of skills tested in an IQ test, right? And these skills are not there's a logic behind them, and there's actually a bias behind them too, right? Like the skills tested on an IQ test are things like short-term memory, um, productivity, pattern recognition, um, all of these things that are usually pretty difficult for kids with Down syndrome, and other intellectual disabilities. So therefore, like our schools have been set up in a way that rewards and normalizes those kinds of skills and those kinds of ways of learning, right? So what I'm saying is that like, and when I'm arguing for things like inclusion and not having segregated classrooms, I don't mean to be prescriptive about that, right? Like it's a personal um, situation where everyone has to kind of figure out what's best for themselves. But that's kind of the point, right? Like we should have an education system that is personalized enough to reward and value everyone's way of learning, right? Like so that it's not as if you can't learn this. You're not good at these skills, so like you don't have that opportunity anymore. We have to kind of think about um, offering opportunities to all learners in all sorts of ways, and yes, realize that like resources need to go to the people that are struggling, but that's not usually how it works, right? Like the people that get the resources again are the ones that are in power, and that's usually sort of white affluent parents that have the time and resources to advocate for their kids.
Yeah.
um,
I know. I will say I didn't add this to one of my questions because I was still like, I'm still processing your book, but I think the the chapter on gifted kids,
yeah.
I could feel your like energy during that chapter, and I have the same energy about it, because it's almost just like I want, I have a lot of, I mean, it honestly seems in my life that every single one of my friends' kids are gifted. So
Right.
it's interesting that
Yeah,
like,
and it's like the same with me because I think Jen, we're from the kind of same class of people, right? And like I've become much more skeptical of what, say, people mean when they say good schools. You
yeah.
know, like what do you mean by that? You probably mean like white schools, right?
Hmm.
And that's where you give a lot of resources to gifted programs.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think I interrupted you, Jane. Go ahead.
No, it was a chapter. You told a little story. Tell the story if you can, like at the beginning of the chapter where you're talking about like the kid wanting to go to space camp and how that made you feel. Because I feel like I have the same kind of feelings about it where I'm just like, I mean, my babes wants to go to, like, Jack would love to go to space camp, you know? And those
Hmm.
opportunities are not afforded to him
Yeah,
so many
yeah.
times. Like I've already been told, like, well, a lot of the kids are gonna go to. I had a child that I was helping who all of the kids went to the Air Force Museum. And like, well, he won't even like it anyway. He'll want to go to the park. That's where we take the kids in the multidisciplinary room to the park.
Mm,
And I'm like, but that museum is so accessible. It's so inclusive. It's such a big, wide open space for his wheelchair. Like
hmm.
everything about it, I was like, why would we assume he wouldn't want to go to the Air and Space Museum? And
Right,
it's just
right.
already
Because
like
it's
a foretold conclusion that like only certain kids, like the IQ in the bell curve, like helps. It's made for the medium kids, and then it helps the kids with the high IQs get these gifted things, and it just really hurts our kids. And
right. I mean, there's yes, like if you're on the right side of the peak of the bell curve, that's a kind of exceptional place that you want to be. And there's people who developed the idea of giftedness like in the mid 20th century, really like thought it was like almost of national importance to
yeah,
cultivate those kids, right? Like that was um the motivation behind putting resources to gifted programs is like it was a kind of space race Cold War sort of thing, is where we need to
Hmm.
cultivate these minds so that they can beat the Russians.
yeah,
And then there was still so much discrimination at that time about whether people on the other side of the bell curve should even be in school at all. Um, weren't given the same kind of resources to learn, right? So I start off the gifted chapter with an experience I had where like this lovely little girl in fifth grade comes to our door and is like fundraising for this trip to go to space camp as part of her gifted program. And she didn't say like it's part of my gifted program, but I had heard around, like I knew this was kind of coming up in and heard in our community that it was happening. And I just felt like I often do as a parent of a kid with a disability, in the sense that it was very isolating, that kind of experience. And I also maybe it's part of being a woman, as well, of like um I just have to kind of shut up and take it, right? And act as if my situation is like everybody else's, although it's not. Um, and so we just had to kind of like smile, and I said, "No, thanks. We're good. We don't need any cake rolls today." But it just like it seemed like such a blatant kind of slap in the face
Hmm.
of the situation. And I don't blame the lovely child. I don't blame her parent either, but it was just at that point I just had gotten really sick of making excuses for things, right? Like the
Hmm.
fact that I feel like I am part of this class, that I am a kind of an achiever and have that history of a certain mindset of that, um, you know, makes me kind of repress a lot. I think just be like, oh, well, it's okay. Like even with the IQ test, it's like, well, they're not going to see it. It'll be fine. Like, I think that is just something I've unfortunately ingrained even in myself as being a woman. Like, it's fine.
yeah, yeah,
And I had just gotten really sick of it by that point. And I think that that's why that chapter might have a bit of an edge to it.
See, I like the edge. Okay, so toward the end of the book, I know Lindsay and I do policy stuff. Like she does the
Hmm.
federal, I do the state. And so I'm always looking for the policy to talk about. So toward the end of the book, I was reading, I'm just going to read a little bit, if you don't mind, a paragraph where you say, you're talking about a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, the chapter is called Paradigm Shift.
Hmm.
And you're talking about a shared citizenship paradigm. You're also talking about an intelligence, like thinking about the function of intelligence rather than like the IQ test,
Yep.
just intelligence for intelligence sake. And you say, in order for a broader paradigm shift to occur, we would have to value the people who work in disability care professions and pay them more. So there is consistency and experience in these positions. We would need to train educators from kindergarten teachers to college professors to teach all types of learners. Employers would need to value community investment and inclusive workspaces over efficiency, speed, and the size of their profit. Doctors would need to listen to patients with disabilities, involve them in medical decisions, and see that life with a disability does not make it less valuable. It would involve taking this new logic beyond the field of psychology and considering how it might inspire a shift in the way we think about our priorities. It would require us to move away from the high stakes testing and reevaluate what we think those tests are telling us. In other words, it would involve rethinking the relationship between intelligence and care. And I thought, oh, I like that paragraph. It says a lot about policy and it touches on exactly what my passion is, which is care and caregiving.
Yeah.
Tell us.
Yeah. I mean, and like all of the things in the part, all of those things that I mentioned in the part that you just read, Jen, are legacies of eugenics, right? Like going back to that, all of those ways in which we think about care, we think about um, involvement in medical decisions, the way that we think about work, all of those are legacies of eugenics, right? And something else that I think a lot about, especially with care, is the way in which we also like we value independence so much, right? Like this is supposed to be kind of like the IEP goal
Yes,
that everybody has is like we're
yes.
we're supposed to be independent. Like
Hmm.
who in this world on this planet is independent? Like everyone is dependent on each other. And we should recognize that and value that. And I think like that is the first step to respecting everybody's role in this world rather than judging people and comparing people in terms of how independent they are. Like what if we actually valued the people that we are most dependent on,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
caregivers and teachers, for example.
Yeah, and we were talking about how we saw each other on Monday. We saw each other because we were at the State House,
Right.
um, advocating for sub minimum wage, and you talk to getting rid of it for people with
Yes.
disabilities. Talk a little bit about sub minimum wage and HB 427, just to throw that out there again for us to
Yeah.
get people on
So
board.
Ohio HB 427 is a bill that has been introduced in Ohio to phase out sub-minimum wage working conditions. So even when we were talking to our legislators on Monday, Jen, like I asked everyone I talked to in different legislators and Congress people's office, like, have you ever heard of 14C certificates? And most of them were like, nope. And so yeah, most people don't know about this, that the so it is legal under a 14C certificate business holder to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. And this is something 14C certificates began with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the same thing that kind of established minimum wage in the country. And then there was this sort of like caveat of but you can pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. So already there's a kind of devaluing. And of course, most of these jobs with sub-minimum wage are in isolated working conditions, right? So they're in places where they're isolated from the community and then paid less than minimum wage. And it just seems again to me like the last frontier of civil rights discrimination, right? Like this is the one place where it is still somehow acceptable in our country to discriminate against people, and
Yeah.
it's people with intellectual disabilities. And you know, like I am not interested in getting rid of care centers and day programs for people with intellectual disabilities. But I think if you're going to ask them to do work for a company, or ask them to do work at all, you need to require that they're paid minimum wage, right? Like we should keep day centers for and community centers for people with disabilities, but if they're doing work, they should be paid minimum wage. It's an
Mhm.
issue of civil rights to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for
Agreed.
continuing your advocacy in that area because it's so
Mhm.
important. And I was telling, we were interviewed by like a local reporter, and I was like, Pepper and I and Lindsay are doing such hard work, kind of trying to change systems and push our school systems and push our communities and doing these things. And our kids work even harder than that.
Yeah.
Actually, when we're pushing that system to actually have to show them, yeah, I do belong here. Like, here I am
Right.
trying to keep up
Yep.
with my peers. And we do all this work. And at the end of the day, there's going to be this horrible vestige of, 100 years ago left. That's an opportunity for them to make 22 cents an hour. Like, it, it,
Yeah.
to me, it's clearly civil rights, but it's also just like Ohioans, like we take care of people here. Like we're supposed to be better. And 21 states have gotten rid of this.
Yep.
The federal government, eventually this will go away, but obviously our federal government takes forever to do anything.
It does everything so slow.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Ohio needs to get on board with this. And it just kind of, to me, advocating for this is so common sense. Like you said, people don't even know it's a thing. So it's just like, let's get past this so we can actually
Right.
do the work that we need.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I mean, it is, I also don't think people realize the fear that parents of people with intellectual disabilities hold of what will happen to my kid when I am no longer here, right? And it is a matter of allowing making sure that our kids do not slip through the cracks and are exploited.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's so
That's really
many, yeah, there's so many good parts of this book, Pepper. I want to like end with us talking about the labels that the IQ test puts on our kids and what is intelligence, mean in our culture. And you write so beautifully. It's not a memoir. This is a book about the IQ test and the history, but you do
yeah.
kind of interlace a few stories about your own life, which I greatly appreciate because I think it gives the book a lot of heart and it gives the book a lot of like welcoming to like more audiences than just professors and
Yes. Right.
people that
Thank you.
are definitely clinical psychologists. I think it opens the door to parents and families, so I definitely encourage people. But I wanted to read one more paragraph that it just touched me, and I think it got kind of the essence of why you wrote this book. And it's the chapter where you talk about there's more intelligence in Louisa than just her academics. Like,
Yeah.
and you start talking about dance class, and you say, I glanced to my right and to my left. None of the other parents' faces wear the same unbridled smile that is on mine. They're looking at their phones. They're trying to make sure their son isn't making too much noise. I look down at my phone too, because watching Louisa dance is like looking at the sun. Her radiance, simply that she participates in this class, fills my chest with such warmth and happiness, I can barely stand it. And I just thought that was so beautiful. And I too have had these moments. I know you have, Lindsay, where you describe it here, but for me, it's so undescribable, like having Evie and Jack in my life,
Yeah.
and just how beyond all of the stupid tests and all the things that we do to them. They are as people and what they give to my life just as being my kids and like watching Louisa dance, like is like looking at the sun. I just
Yeah,
thought it's just a
thank
gorgeous
you.
way of talking about it and about her as a
Mhm.
she is fully valuable beyond all of these other things. And you see it, and what we will need is for everyone else to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like nobody, she's still at it with the dance and she's just awesome and nobody enjoys it more than
Yeah.
her in that class, right? Like she, you
Mhm.
know, by certain standards, she's not the best dancer, but whatever. Like I don't care. She's in that class and she is like she's the most joyful dancer in there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And like I am so grateful for that. And I want, you know, I want a world that looks for the most joy in people
Mhm.
rather than the most pointed toes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Balance. I want a world where joy is
Mhm.
valued and we don't get to joy through
Yeah.
IQ
You're exactly
Yeah.
right. Well, that's a perfect way to end it.
Excellent.
We're not going to get there through IQ test, people. And
We're
it's
not.
a big subject, and I think, like you said, like it's a way to get services. But I think your book also showed how grateful parents like us are for good teachers, and
Yeah, that
Mhm.
can see through all of
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and they actually see our kids and see what they bring to their
Yeah.
classrooms and beyond.
Yeah.
And
Amen. That's the good place to end, right? Yay for the
Mhm.
teachers.
Yes. Yes. Yay for the teachers.
Yeah.
thank God for teachers, or I would my kids would be here right now with me, you know?
Right.
Yeah. COVID taught me that dropping out of being in education and becoming a nurse was the best I could have ever done for myself because trying to be my son's everything during COVID, my daughter was 2 at the time, so she wasn't in school. But
Uh-huh.
trying to be his everything during that time,
I mean,
oh
that's
my
all I thought
goodness.
about. If we don't give these
Yeah.
people a raise after COVID,
I
like,
Yeah.
know.
I mean, didn't we all learn just how
Exactly.
I know.
I
valuable?
make sure that we know every teacher on our son's team at the beginning of the school year, and we give them a welcome to the team gift because I know that I can be a lot, and I can't even imagine who plate like
Yeah.
their caseload for the year.
Yeah.
Just because, yeah,
It
thank
is.
God
It's a
for.
constant, with me at least, like it is a constant battle in myself of like I don't want to be that parent that everybody
Yeah.
like all the teachers dread and is
Hmm.
constantly emailing them and you know but I also want to advocate for my kid and make sure
Right.
so it's like this constant push and pull of like guilt
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
assertion and
It's why
yeah.
we make sure they're well fed specific times of the year and we give them presents at
Yeah.
the start of the year because I'm like, I know that I am a lot. And so welcome to our team. Have a snack and Chipotle on me.
Yeah, I wish I could give them a lot more than
I know,
that.
right?
Same.
All right, well, real quick, tell everybody where they can find your book.
Okay, so A Measure of Intelligence, One Mother's Reckoning with the IQ Test. You can get it anywhere books are sold. I think even like all the online places, Joseph Beth in Cincinnati has it. Um, and yes, anywhere you get your books, you can find it.
All right, Professor Pepper Stetler. It's Stetler, just so you can find the book. Thank you so much.
This was such a
And
pleasure. Thank you.
Have a
Great
great
to
rest
see
of
you
the day.
both.
Thanks.
Yeah.